October 12, 1945. A bitter wind swept across the shattered streets of a small town in the Rhineland, carrying with it the dust of collapsed rooftops and the faint smoke of smoldering ruins. The war had ended officially with proclamations of victory and the fanfare of occupying forces, yet the streets remained quiet, punctuated only by the distant clatter of boots along cobblestones and the occasional crack of timber settling. Posters celebrating liberation and American soldiers adorned the corners of buildings, yet behind shuttered windows, the lives of ordinary citizens unfolded in muted struggle, unseen and largely unrecorded. It was here, in this interstice between public celebration and private desolation, that a young boy and his widowed mother navigated the fragile debris of their existence. The widow's home, a small apartment above a partially collapsed bakery, smelled faintly of charred wood and the lingering tang of damp flour. Furniture leaned at angles that defied gravity, patched hastily with cloth and string. From the street, the laughter and calls of American troops could be heard, a rhythm unfamiliar and intrusive, promising safety but offering little comfort. Inside, the widow moved quietly, her hands calloused from clearing rubble and rationing what little remained of their provisions. The boy, no older than 10, followed her in silence, absorbing the subtleties of a world that had been torn apart, the uneven light across cracked plaster, the scent of scorched earth after a brief rain, the absence of neighbors who had vanished into exile or death. It was in this intimate, fragile world that the paradox of human connection began to surface. Outside, soldiers represented authority, power, and the abstract terms of victory. Inside, they were human figures, sometimes generous, sometimes distant, entering a life already laden with grief. One afternoon, in the filtered gray light of a late autumn morning, the boy approached an American soldier who had been stationed near the edge of town. Words stumbled from his small lips, not rehearsed or politicized. "You need a wife and mother needs a home." The simplicity of the statement belied a profound tension, between child and adult, between conquered and conqueror, between the public narratives of war and the private urgencies of survival. The moment lingered, suspended, as if the air itself had absorbed the weight of unspoken histories. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Inside, the quiet hum of a kettle on a stove marked the rhythm of a life attempting to resume. There was no applause, no record in the official dispatches, only the weight of two lives intersecting briefly across the chasm of war's aftermath. The boy's eyes, wide and searching, carried a question the soldier did not answer aloud, and perhaps could not. Could the brokenness of a child's world meet the authority and ordinariness of a soldier's duty? This encounter, small and fragile, embodied the contradictions that would define the post-war landscape. Human need against military presence, the quiet persistence of grief against the public narrative of triumph, the persistent ambiguity of what it meant to survive. In the quiet, in the rubble-strewn streets and the half-empty rooms, there remained a question that no report, no photograph, no medal could answer. What becomes of the lives that hover between the history we remember and the histories we almost overlook? The town, still bearing the wounds of artillery and bombing, settled into a fragile rhythm. Mornings began with the sound of distant vehicles rolling over cobblestones, the low murmur of soldiers in their temporary quarters, and the occasional creak of doors long unhinged by blasts. The widow's apartment, perched on the second floor above what had once been a bustling bakery, smelled of soot and bread, the latter baked in fits and starts on a small gas stove that rattled with every use. She rose early, careful not to wake the boy, collecting water from a communal tap where lines of neighbors waited with tin pails and buckets. The water tasted of rust and lingering smoke, but it was warmth enough to brew tea and soften the hard bread that remained. The boy, whose name was Matthias, followed her silently, watching the way her hands moved over the counters, smoothing the uneven surface of a table patched with canvas. She hummed a low, unpracticed tune, the kind learned in kitchen corners, not meant for ears beyond the walls. At night, Matthias would sit by the broken window, listening to the quiet footsteps outside, the shuffle of boots and the soft thud of supplies being delivered. He began to memorize the routines of the American soldiers stationed near the edge of the town, the measured cadence of their drill, the way some spoke in bursts of laughter while others remained distant, gazing over the horizon. In letters later recovered from an officer's correspondence, one soldier wrote of a small boy who watches us with wide eyes, muttering words we scarcely understand. There was a fascination, almost clinical in its precision, in these observations. To the soldiers, the boy's presence was a faint intrusion on an otherwise orderly occupation, yet his words, simple and almost accidental, carried a weight that unsettled them. He spoke of need and of home with a certainty that seemed to defy the chaos around him. The soldiers, trained to catalog movements, to anticipate threats and enforce order, found themselves encountering a reality they could neither structure nor command. Daily life for the widow and her son was measured by scarcity and improvisation. Rations arrived inconsistently, sometimes a small packet of dried beans, a few potatoes, a loaf of bread barely larger than a hand. Clothing was mended repeatedly, patches overlapping in a quilt of desperation and care. On market days, when a few stalls reopened amid the ruins, the air was thick with the smell of roasted coffee, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of coinage. The widow moved quietly through these spaces, her hands gripping the straps of a basket worn thin by use. Matthias clung to her skirts, eyes alert to the way soldiers watched, the glances of neighbors whose expressions were a mixture of exhaustion, suspicion, and relief. Inside the apartment, conversations were often whispered. The boy asked questions that could not be answered simply. Why had their city been destroyed? Why had soldiers come? Why could a home not simply exist without interference? The widow's responses were careful, measured, as though words could mend plaster and timber, soothe the bruises of hunger, or fill the emptiness of lost lives. She spoke of necessity and endurance, of moving forward one day at a time, yet her eyes betrayed the exhaustion of constant vigilance, the quiet terror that another misstep, another rumor, another inspection, could undo what little stability remained. The presence of the American soldiers introduced contradictions that neither Matthias nor his mother could reconcile. One soldier, Corporal Daniels, was often seen distributing extra rations to families near the town square. He carried himself with a deliberate calm, his uniform pressed, boots polished, a small notebook in which he jotted observations about the civilians he encountered. Yet the same soldier was bound by orders that dictated his movements, his interactions, the distance he must maintain. He offered kindness within the limits of regulation, gestures constrained by duty, never fully bridging the gulf between occupier and occupied. In the evenings, when the sun slanted low across the skeletal remains of buildings, Matthias sometimes wandered to the edge of the square. He watched as soldiers played cards or cleaned rifles, the metallic scrape echoing against broken walls. He remembered fragments of conversations overheard, phrases like, next supply drop, orderly conduct, liaison with local authorities. Words that made sense in military logic, yet seemed to float past him, irrelevant to the urgent, immediate world inside the apartment. One evening he whispered to his mother, "They have homes and we do not. Can we ask for one?" Her response was a gentle silence, her hands tightening briefly on his shoulders, not in admonition but in recognition of a truth too large for either of them to confront fully. The psychological tension of these encounters began to manifest subtly. Matthias noticed patterns in the soldiers' behavior, which one spoke to children, which ignored them, which lingered at street corners, which disappeared into the shadows of half-collapsed buildings. He began to anticipate their movements, the timbre of voices, the way uniforms caught the late afternoon light. The boy's awareness sharpened, not in calculation but in survival, a quiet vigilance that mirrored the adaptive behaviors of his mother. It was a world governed by proximity and observation, where every interaction carried potential consequence, where trust was measured in seconds and misunderstanding could prove perilous. There were brief, almost imperceptible shifts in relationships. One soldier allowed Matthias to carry a small parcel of flour to the apartment, a gesture so ordinary it almost went unnoticed. Another provided a tin of condensed milk, its sweetness a stark contrast to the bland rations of the day. These moments, fleeting and constrained, held the weight of possibility. Yet they existed alongside the formalities of occupation. Inspections, curfews, regulations imposed with rigid precision. The emotional tension was constant, oscillating between the boy's hope and the sobering realities of authority. The boy's own voice began to carry fragments of the paradox he witnessed. In whispered statements to his mother, he recounted moments of generosity alongside moments of strictness. "They are kind sometimes," he said, "but they leave quickly. We cannot touch the things they carry." There was an implicit understanding that the presence of the soldier was both shelter and boundary, comfort and limitation. This duality became the rhythm of their days, a silent negotiation of space, attention, and need. Observers, both civilian and military, noted the subtle transformations that took place. A local baker recorded in a diary, "The boy watches more than he plays. His mother moves with the weight of the world in her hands." An American officer reported, "The child's eyes follow us wherever we go. He speaks little, but when he does, his words are precise, almost unnerving in their simplicity." The town itself, battered and depopulated, seemed to absorb these small interactions into the larger, chaotic narrative of post-war life. Ruins filled with whispers, dust-laden streets where survival and authority collided quietly, insistently. The widow, too, was transformed by these encounters. Her movements became a series of careful calculations: how long to remain in sunlight, which streets to traverse, which voices to engage. She taught Matthias how to interpret gestures, how to listen beyond words, how to navigate the invisible hierarchies that now structured their existence. The apartment became a microcosm of the world outside, fragile, contested, suffused with both potential and danger. As weeks passed, the tension deepened. The boy's words, spoken initially as an innocent observation, "You need a wife and mother needs a home," reverberated in unexpected ways. Soldiers reacted with brief hesitation, noting the simplicity of the statement, yet sensing an implicit demand, a silent assertion of human need that could not be categorized as a request or complaint. For Matthias, the act of speaking became an exploration of limits. How close could he approach the soldiers? How direct could he be? How much of his mother's vulnerability could he expose safely? Each day, the stakes of these small interactions were measured not in grand consequences, but in subtle shifts of attention, tone, and movement. Small routines became the scaffolding for psychological endurance. Meals were eaten standing by the stove, blankets were spread over broken furniture. Books salvaged from rubble offered a fragile connection to a world beyond the immediate ruins. Conversations were marked by pauses, ellipses of hesitation, moments when the weight of silence articulated more than words could. Outside, the American soldiers carried on with drills, patrols, and deliveries, unaware of the microcosm of observation and adaptation unfolding in the apartment above the street. The paradox persisted. These soldiers, symbols of liberation and power, were also the arbiters of control, the gatekeepers of stability and constraint. The boy and his mother navigated a delicate lattice of dependence and distance. At times, the soldier's presence offered warmth, a brief reprieve from hunger and isolation. At other times, it imposed a reminder of vulnerability, of exposure to forces beyond their understanding. The tension was quiet, pervasive, and unresolvable, shaping the contours of every moment in their shared yet separate worlds. At night, the sounds of the town settled into a tense lull. Timber creaked, wind whispered through shattered windows, distant footsteps echoed against empty streets. Matthias lay beside his mother, their bodies a shared warmth against the chill of post-war autumn. In the darkness, he replayed the day's interactions, measuring kindness and restraint, noting the gestures of the soldiers and the reactions of neighbors. The boy's thoughts were both concrete and abstract. A ration of bread, the fold of a sleeve, the inflection of a voice, and the larger, unspoken question of how human need could exist within the machinery of occupation. Days blurred into one another. The psychological landscape of the apartment, of the street, and of the town as a whole remained one of quiet tension and subtle negotiation. Diaries, letters, and recalled statements, all fragments later pieced together, reveal a life of constant observation, small adaptations, and unarticulated questions. The boy's words lingered: "You need a wife and mother needs a home." They were simple, yet freighted with ambiguity, demanding acknowledgement without asserting command. Each interaction, each small gesture, carried a layered significance that could neither be fully controlled nor fully understood. Even as rations stabilized and some semblance of routine returned, the underlying paradox endured. The soldiers remained figures of authority and compassion, presence and absence, reassurance and constraint. The widow and her son continued their delicate negotiation of proximity and need, their days defined less by explicit events than by the cumulative weight of countless small choices, observed gestures, and unspoken rules. The tension was neither dramatic nor overt. It was quiet, insistent, shaping the contours of thought, behavior, and emotion. In the final weeks of autumn, the town seemed suspended between ruin and renewal. Leaves fell over cracked streets, the wind carried the scent of distant fields, sunlight filtered through shattered windows onto patched furniture. The boy and his mother remained at the threshold of new possibility, their lives intertwined with the soldier's presence, yet distinct, bounded, and precarious. The paradox of need and authority, of human desire and structural constraint, remained unresolved, shaping the rhythm of their days in subtle but persistent ways. The story of a child speaking simple truth to a soldier, of a mother negotiating survival in the aftermath of total destruction, illuminates a terrain of human experience often absent from official histories, the quiet, persistent, and paradoxical realities of life in the shadow of victory. Here, the psychological weight of occupation, the frailty of home, and the intensity of need converge, not in spectacle, but in the small, exacting details of daily existence. What emerges is not a narrative of triumph or tragedy, but a measured, almost unbearable awareness of the complexity of human life in the ruins of war. A landscape where a single sentence, a single act of observation, can carry the weight of worlds. The streets that once echoed with the clatter of boots and the harsh cadence of orders had, by winter, fallen into a tentative stillness. The American soldiers who had patrolled the town for months were slowly withdrawn, reassigned to other sectors of occupation or returned home. Their departure left behind an absence as tangible as the ruins themselves. A silence punctuated by the faint drip of melting snow from shattered rooftops, the rustle of dry leaves across cobblestones, and the occasional groan of splintered timber settling under frost. Within the small apartment above the collapsed bakery, the widow and her son navigated this new quiet with a wariness that had become instinctive. Every creak of floorboard or whisper of wind through broken window panes was noted, catalogued, measured against months of learned vigilance. The departure of the soldiers did not bring relief in the ways the boy had imagined. Matthias, now slightly older and quieter, watched the doorways and corners where soldiers had once stood, as if expecting them to return. The routines that had structured daily life, the careful pacing to the communal water tap, the quiet assessment of who approached their door, the soft negotiation of interactions, remained. Survival had instilled habits that persisted beyond the immediate presence of authority. The mother moved with the same meticulous care, arranging patched blankets over broken furniture, storing rationed potatoes in jars once used for preserves, listening for the low hum of distant activity that could signify both opportunity and threat. Memory became a heavy presence in the empty apartment. Matthias recalled the brief moments of generosity, a tin of condensed milk, a parcel of flour, a small loaf of bread passed across the street. Alongside the formal inspections, the rigid curfews, the reminders that even kindness existed within constraints. These recollections were not linear, they arrived in fragments, overlapping and refracting against each other. The boy remembered the smell of soldiers' uniforms mixed with tobacco, the cold metal of rifle barrels glinting in the weak autumn sun, the faint hum of engines in the distance. He remembered the way his mother's eyes would flicker toward the street when voices approached, and the quiet reassurance in the grip of her hand. Time passed slowly. Snow melted, leaving mud and debris in its wake. Rations continued to arrive intermittently, but the world beyond their immediate walls remained unpredictable. Neighbors returned, some carrying stories of flight or imprisonment, others of survival through hardship that had left them physically intact but emotionally hollow. Conversations among the residents were cautious, laced with half-uttered observations and silences that could signify both complicity and sorrow. The boy and his mother were part of this hesitant rhythm, their lives intertwined with the town's, yet defined by the particularities of their experience. A home half destroyed, a body of memories heavy with observation, a cautious relationship to those who had once held power over them. Matthias often spoke of the soldiers in fragments of conversation, not as heroes or villains, but as figures suspended between action and passivity, capable of generosity and bound by regulation. "They gave," he whispered one evening, tracing the seam of a patched blanket with a small finger, "but only because they could not stay. Only because they were passing through." His mother said nothing, her gaze distant, focused on the faint smoke curling from a neighbor's hearth. Words were insufficient. They had never fully encompassed the paradox of need and authority, of human gesture caught in the machinery of circumstance. Long after the war's official end, letters and diaries collected by occupying officers and local civilians provided fragments of the past that were only partially intelligible. A letter from Corporal Daniels, dated months after leaving the town, described a small boy who spoke boldly and simply, words that lingered longer than orders or reports. An entry in a local diary noted, "The widow moves with precision now, as if the absence of soldiers could undo what their presence had structured." These records, while distant and mediated, preserve the tension between memory and material reality, between the impressions of those who moved through the town as agents of history and the lived, quotidian experience of those who remained. The paradox of home persisted. The apartment, repaired in the most minimal sense, remained a fragile shell. Floors were uneven, walls patched with scraps of plaster and cloth, windows replaced with mismatched panes of glass. Yet it was home and it was not. It offered shelter and continuity, yet every corner, every surface, carried the imprint of absence and need. The boy understood this intuitively. The home that existed was a negotiation, a temporary construct held together by effort, memory, and the quiet insistence of survival. The world outside, rebuilt in stages by authorities and neighbors, continued to exert pressures that no simple reconstruction could fully mitigate. Visitors occasionally arrived. Distant relatives, neighbors passing on news, officials conducting inspections. The boy's relationship to them was measured, careful, the product of years attuned to nuance. Each approach was assessed, every gesture interpreted for the potential it carried. Even after the soldier's departure, the internalized patterns of observation, of weighing risk against reward, of gauging the intentions behind speech and movement remained. Survival had become as much a mental exercise as a physical one. The emotional residue of those months lingered in ways both subtle and pervasive. Matthias recalled the words he had spoken to the soldier, "You need a wife and mother needs a home." In memory, they had taken on a weight beyond their original utterance, resonating with questions that could not be answered. What constituted need? How was it acknowledged or ignored? How could authority and vulnerability coexist in a world freshly scarred by conflict? The simplicity of the statement, almost childish in form, now seemed to carry the entire burden of post-war ambiguity, the tension between desire and limitation, between visibility and erasure. Years later, the widow and her son would remember the soldiers not with nostalgia, nor with bitterness, but with an uneasy clarity. The interactions that had seemed fleeting at the time now appeared as structural markers, shaping the ways in which boundaries, trust, and human expectation were understood. Memory preserved gestures as much as words. A loaf handed over a fence, the patter of boots across frozen ground, the quiet observation of eyes that noted both need and restraint. These memories were never neatly categorized, never simplified into moral binaries. They existed in a gray, persistent space where human behavior and circumstance intersected in ways that were often contradictory, sometimes incomprehensible. The town itself, gradually reconstructed, bore witness to these human residues. Streets were cleared, buildings repaired, commerce resumed in cautious increments. Yet the psychological landscape, of observation, of negotiation, of unspoken tension, remained embedded in the routines and rhythms of daily life. The boy, now carrying the memory of his own childhood within these spaces, could perceive traces of those months in the gestures of new neighbors, in the rhythms of household routines, in the silent negotiation of authority and need that never entirely disappeared. The widow, whose hands had once been rough with labor and vigilance, aged in the shadow of both loss and survival. Her attention remained finely tuned to the smallest indicators of risk or opportunity. She did not speak often of the soldiers who had come and gone, yet her life had been quietly structured by their presence. In small ways, the arrangement of furniture, the pacing of daily tasks, the allocation of rations, she carried the imprint of interactions that were as ephemeral as they were decisive. Memory, for both mother and son, became inseparable from material reality. Objects held stories: the patched blanket, a tin once filled with condensed milk, a floorboard warped by frost, the charred remnants of a neighboring building. Each item was imbued with layered significance, a trace of generosity, a mark of scarcity, a reminder of the delicate tension between survival and authority. To inhabit these spaces was to inhabit the past, even as the town moved forward into reconstruction and normalization. The larger historical narratives, the proclamations of victory, the photographs of liberated cities, the public ceremonies marking the end of war, exist alongside these quiet, unrecorded experiences. The official accounts celebrate movement, strategy, and outcomes. The personal, human dimension resides in observation, in subtle negotiation, in the daily articulation of need against circumstance. The widow and her son, their lives entwined with the temporal presence of soldiers, exemplify this tension, inhabiting a space where history and memory, authority and vulnerability, coexist uneasily. As decades passed, Matthias would recall not the grand events but the textures of those months: the sound of wind through broken windows, the metallic clatter of rifles against stone, the faint aroma of bread baking over a patched stove, the hesitant steps of neighbors returning to streets lined with rubble. He remembered words spoken with startling simplicity, gestures laden with unspoken significance, and the quiet endurance of a mother whose survival dictated the rhythm of his own life. The ordinary, the overlooked, the seemingly insignificant, all of it acquired a resonance far beyond its immediate context, shaping perceptions of human need, authority, and the contours of daily existence. The paradox remained unresolved. The soldier's presence had been both protective and intrusive, generous and constrained, ordinary and extraordinary. The home had existed as a fragile construct, both shelter and reminder of absence, continuity and impermanence. The boy's utterance, You need a wife and mother needs a home, lingered as a reminder of the quiet, insistent contradictions that defined post-war life. The tension between what is desired and what is possible, between recognition and erasure, between the fleeting gestures of human compassion and the structural realities of occupation. Even as the town recovered, as buildings were repaired and streets cleared, the shadow of those months remained in small, almost imperceptible ways. Memory, materiality, and habit converged to preserve a truth that was neither celebrated nor condemned: that human lives, in their quiet, everyday existence, could both shape and be shaped by forces far larger than themselves. In the lingering frost of winter mornings, in the hush of evenings when shadows lengthened across patched floors, the past whispered insistently, refusing to be contained within simple narratives of triumph or defeat. And so the question endures, settling over the town and its rebuilt streets, over the quiet apartment where a mother and her son once navigated the delicate interplay of need and authority. How do we measure the weight of human presence in a world structured by absence, and what remains of those who exist quietly between the lines of history and memory?